Welcome to the Transatlantic, a podcast produced by the U.S. Helsinki Commission. Each episode, we will talk to people behind the debates and developments shaping the struggle for freedom and security here in the United States, Europe, Central Asia, and around the world. These conversations will cross oceans, intellectual divides, and political affiliations. We'll look forward to having you along for the ride. My name is Bakhti and Adrian, and I'm a senior policy advisor at the Commission, and I will be your host.
What's very striking for me, and it deserves much more attention, is the vehicles of protest that are in many ways built upon the 1968ers, and there is one statement: Russians go back home, and this was written on graffitis. And in 1968, you could see famous pictures, and then I saw this. We can see that in Ukraine as well.
Adrian Matus is an educator, a scholar, and the editor of the Democracy and Culture. He defended his PhD in history at the European University Institute in 2022. He then wrote a book entitled The Long 1968 in Hungary and Romania. Previously, he graduated from Université Sorbonne, Paris, and Babeș-Bolyai University. From 2020 to 2022, he curated the Communist Parties from Non-Socialist Countries collection at the Blinken Open Society Archives. Then continued researching this topic as a postdoctoral fellow at the new Europe College in Bucharest. Adrian has also worked on various educational initiatives, designing history, cultural studies, and social sciences for high schools, students, asylum seekers, and refugees. Adrian, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I'm extremely honored to have you here.
Excellent. Adrian, we're going to talk about history. We'll talk about 1968 and why it was so special or so important in the history of humanity. But before we do that, I would like to talk about the context of this conversation. So you're based in Budapest, and we are recording this on May 4th in 2026, which means that a few weeks ago, Hungary had an election that probably people even who probably before that might not have known where exactly Hungary was, have heard about it by now. Can we talk about a little bit about the importance of that election, what happened, and then we'll try to connect up to what had happened before in Hungary in that part of the world.
Yes, so indeed, Hungary witnessed a historical moment, and after 16 years of the Orbán regime, so the so-called illiberal democracy, witnessed a transition. There was an election, and in which the new candidate, Péter Magyar, won the large majority. And this had very important implications for politics, for the broader perspectives about European Union as well, and about the future of Europe in many ways.
Let's talk about the book, The Long 1968 in Hungary and Romania. Full disclosure, we're probably going to go beyond Hungary and Romania because 1968, probably the most important historic event, happened outside of these particular borders. But why the title? Why specifically 1968? And what was the role of Hungary and Romania to an extent, but in everything that was unfolding in that 1968? Because it was truly a historic moment.
As you mentioned, and I fully agree with you, it was a moment in which was not so much related to one country. And here I would like to start by defining the terms, because as I argue in my book, I'm not practically talking about a 1 year only, but a period, which retroactively historians name it as the long 1968. And allow me to expand why I prefer to use this period. Because on one hand, it's a period of rupture from the past. We witnessed a generation that was born in 1945 and that reached a political maturity during that time. And at the same time, it was this moment of relative economic affluence, or at least they lived better than the previous generation. And this created a very strong ferment for consolidating a distinctive generation that had a distinctive discourse, which was everywhere. So from Japan to the US, from South America to Soviet Union. And they proposed new political solutions, which interestingly, it was very, in many ways, the first step was to put into scrutiny everyone over 30 years old. And they created a new kind of all political, but also cultural solutions. In a one way, it's a rupture from the past. So you question the legitimacy of old people in a way. But at the same time, it's a self-fashioned period. Because on one hand, historians, as you mentioned, perhaps might be caught into this kind of intellectual debates, which happen in conferences or in university halls. But this debate opened up throughout last years, and it became political. And up until 2008, the whole discussion about 1968, the protests and so on, was for a smaller stake only for scholars. But then in 2007, to anticipate 2008, the French president at that time, Nicolas Sarkozy, stated one very curious, and made a very, very controversial statement that the 68ers, so the generation that created this movement, created a moral and intellectual relativism and difference. They cannot distinguish between good and bad. And in that context, this was reheated on a political level. So it became an ideological tool, which very quickly Viktor Orban took verbatim this argument and injected into Hungary. So quickly, this debate that happened usually between historians that had the time to discuss it in the conference halls became much more political and much more heated.
1968, at that generation, this is a generation that was born after World War II, or right immediately after, or during the war. So this is a generation that came into power, sort of having on that high spirits. The entire world was on high spirits, and they thought, here we are, now we are mature, now we're not like our parents, we can make a difference, we can truly change the world. And you said, so obviously in the United States, we saw, racial injustice, demonstrations against that Vietnam War, all that stuff was happening at that time. Do you think that's the primary reason why we saw this kind of belt, like you said, from Japan to all the way to Eastern Europe? I mean, it's a globe, so whichever way you want to go. Do you think that's what drove it? It was truly a generational push it was ascendancy, political ascendancy of that generation? Or what do you think happened that everyone, I mean, again, this is pre-internet, this is pre-instant messaging and all that kind of stuff. It was happening all over the world. Why did it happen?
On one hand, the media access became widespread and an integral part of everyday life. Then other broader factors contributed to this. The literacy rate increased substantially towards and around this period. And also the technological improvements made their point. And here I put a particular emphasis on radio and on sound recording, which plays a crucial part in my investigation, because music became a commodity that could be sold and promoted. Venues, sound amplification, the idea of creating a Woodstock would have not been possible 10 years before that. So to have all these amplification systems to create a concert and an experience for such a large audience. And as well, there is also the commodity aspect. So youth became a separate public target for commercials, for fashion, which is extremely important to keep in mind. And that also was doubled by magazines, literature, music. And in all of this created a separate segment of customers, right? But at the same time, there were elements that even that brought also the ideological component. So most of the 68ers, as we call it nowadays, were born between 1945 and 53. And in many of them actually needed to confront their past. And the past was not an easy one to digest. Some of their parents might have been collaborators to Nazis, and when they grew up, they needed to ask this question. Others might have been victims of Holocaust, which again, the questions needed to be addressed and then to process and to create a sort of sense towards that. And this moment of maturity coincide with this technological boom and the relative affluence. And all of that into one context created this effervescent element.
Let's talk about 1968, and let's talk about a country that doesn't exist anymore, but now it's two separate countries, but Czechoslovakia. Let's talk about the Prague Spring. Let's talk about what happened there, because I think this is one of the most, people have heard about it, but I don't know if people have a very clear understanding of what actually occurred and what was Moscow's response to what happened there.
So in 1968, after a series of reforms promoted by Dubček, at that time the leader of the country, Moscow, or the Soviet Union at that time, invaded the country with tanks and supported by several countries that were allied, and they belonged to the same military alliance. It was the Warsaw Treaty. And that was a shock in many aspects and in many regards for the whole world, because it shifted the perceptions about socialism and communism. Let me somehow break it down. What were those shifts and changes? Now, all across the world, I mean, up until late 1960s, the communist parties or socialist parties had usually in one main central point of reference, which was Moscow, and then China after a while. However, after 1956 in Hungary, but much stronger in 1968, there were some changes. On one hand, from the geopolitical point, so that's the first point, some countries supported the invasion from the socialist bloc. Hungary sent troops, Poland, except for other countries. So others used this momentum to gain autonomy and visibility. And here Romania was a unique case in which Nicolae Ceausescu, the leader at the time, held a speech against that invasion. So a socialist country actually had a nuanced perspective. Now, the second point is that there were communist parties in non-socialist countries as well. So again, starting from South America to Japan, India, and so on. So the communist parties all had the reference points at some point towards Moscow. But after 1968, they started to question the authority. Some of them had a firm condemnation, others had a nuanced condemnation, others followed Moscow and justified that invasion. And that marked the distanciation from blindly following the directives of Moscow towards a more autonomous and self-fashioned and self-directed option. And overall, what meant it was that the trust and idealism towards the Soviet Union and largely towards their political solution was heavily affected. However, there's the third element, and which youngsters as well strongly reflected on this issue. So again, as you mentioned, when such an event, such an invasion happens, they usually appear, and did appear in newspapers. And that creates a strong emotion by default. And even teenagers coming from the nomenclatura, which means the bureaucratic apparatus of the Communist Party, changed the reference points. So that meant that even children of the Communist Party bureaucrats actually started to reflect and to look for other options. And in that regard, so taking into account the geopolitical point, the the shift and the split within the communist parties everywhere, and the visibility, even for a youngster at that time, that invasion created a sort of distanciation from the ideals that many trusted in the Soviet Union.
Adrian, you mentioned 1956, the uprising in Hungary, which was also crushed by the Soviets, and the numbers are just horrifying, not only of the people who perished, wounded, died, and so on and so forth, but also just a huge, massive brain drain that occurred following that. So this is 1956. And then 1968, we have this Czechoslovakia, the Prague Spring, and we have Hungary sending troops. Obviously, it makes sense because, when the Soviets crushed the attempt in Hungary, they obviously installed their puppet regime and all that kind of stuff. But what was the reaction of just ordinary Hungarians? Because, it wasn't that far removed. They saw that this had happened to them, and now they were doing that in concert with Moscow against the people in Czechoslovakia.
In many ways, soldiers, so young soldiers that were sent to within this intervention were actually questioning, and they had this moment of mistrust and confusion, because, as well as mentioning the reference towards 1956 and towards the event that happened at home were very fresh and very, very vivid for them. And at the same time, and more than this, they started to question as well. But more than this, more than the soldiers that were there, to a certain extent, they as well, youngsters at home started to reflect and to link back the ideas. And in a very strange way, that was a moment in which they realized that they should change the vehicles of protest. And what do I mean by this? Many of the hippies at that time, or the 68ers, realized that, I quote from one interview that I did for my book, "You just cannot go against the empire." I end the quote from the interview. That meant that they knew that in case you do an open protest, an open manifestation against, be it the power, authority, the state, and so on, it will end up in brutal violence. And to this, in Hungary, the memory of 1956, in which many of the key actors of the movements that belong to this period had a reference and saw, in many cases in Budapest, even dead bodies. And at that time, they were between 8 to 10 years old. And that image gets impregnated, and it's very hard to leave it aside. So that brutality of the invasion, and those images influenced in the way in which they realized that a direct confrontation was not possible, and no one wanted, even from the leaders from the Communist Party as well, from Hungary, wanted to avoid the situation to escalate. However, in that context, more subtle forms of protest appeared and emerged.
Let me ask you this, Adrian. So this is 1956. This is 1968. I think people sometimes they think, well, okay, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, they are part of the same sort of union. They are part of the socialist states. They are part of a Soviet. They're not part technically of a Soviet Union, but they're in the same sort of alliance. Okay, Soviet Union intervenes. That means it's somewhat of an internal matter. But these countries, these states were sovereign nations. So then there's a history. Obviously, people know about Afghanistan, Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. So there's then history of Soviet constant meddling in the affairs of their neighbors, of peoples who just want something different. Who maybe don't want to completely break away, but want to change things peacefully, not by taking up arms. So there's this history of that. But somehow in the mind, in the global psyche, there's this idea that Soviet Union was this pacifist, this very kind of, neutral state that all it tried to do is to restore and bring peace to the world. And all of these things is just misunderstandings, just, big brother, little brother, that sort of thing. How confused or how wrong those perceptions are. And maybe I am wrong in my perception of it too. So can you talk about it a little bit? Because there is this narrative that the Soviet Union was this, okay, they did some bad things, but mostly it was a force for good.
So the justifications in many aspects were of the intervention, at least in the late 60s, was done to a sort of hard imposed ultimatum, and slowly the situation escalated, and it's very important to take into account that also the satellite countries which were naming, so at that time Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania up until 60s, were very afraid of the directives of Moscow. Normally, within those countries, you had at least two factions. So the Moscow faction, so those members of the Communist Party that during the interwar period went to Moscow, they were educated, they witnessed the Stalinist purges, they survived the Stalinist purges, they know very well how things should be done, and they were very well connected to the Politburo in Moscow. And then there was the local factions. So the local faction, which often meant communist illegal movements, or those that were organizing in factories and so on, and they kept the spirit of the Communist Party alive. And after the 1945, because that's interesting to see how the transition towards the communist regime was not the same in each country. After 1945, these two sides and two factions needed to work together. And in many aspects, there were frictions between one side and the other. And as you probably may expect, some purges appeared in which one side often competed and put aside the other one. So in that way, the Soviet Union had this very fine way of controlling the what was happening in the satellite countries through these people. To double that, in some cases, there was also the presence of military, namely the Red Army, which again was a constitutive factor of encouraging to take a decision and leave aside another one. And the third point, which here it was the Iron Curtain. So the Iron Curtain, which, as Churchill mentioned, was dividing and cutting and the contacts with Western Europe, Marshall Plan, and so on, which is very interesting. And here is the point. Because normally a school of historians would argue that the Iron Curtain was present from 1945 to 1989. But my case with the hippie movement and the 68ers show that there's a nuance. So whilst ideologically there was a strong fence and the no-go, politically speaking or economically speaking, in terms of music, in terms of radio, in terms of culture, the situation was much more volatile. There was censorship. There were moments in which, for sure, books were confiscated. People were sent to prison to write to Radio Free Europe, which again, that's an important point to take into consideration. However, it proved to be a bit more porous and more dynamic. And in that way, there is this assumption or this statement by a scholar called György Péteri that mentioned this. We discuss about the nylon curtain. The nylon is this material which we could see the light from the other side, but we cannot distinguish the full shapes, and you can try to reconstitute.
I've never heard that before, but I really like that analogy. That's great. What you're saying is music is more powerful than tanks, I guess is what you're saying. You did write quite a bit extensively on specifically on music. What was the role of music? I mean, and specifically, what kind of music we're talking about? What is it did it just inspire people, or people wanted more of it? And what exactly drove people to seek it out? I mean, what's the connection here?
So, in many regards, music, as mentioned, was building up on a technological improvement. So you could have a radio with transistor at home. You could technically sell and buy vinyls. And that created a sort of rapid boom as well, and the leisure for specifically designed for youth. And to add on this, there were as well the fascination towards the rock music, beat music at first, and rock music later became a daily presence. And youngsters started to listen, and to the level that they could, about the bands that were in Western Europe. And quickly and very soon, they wanted also to mimic and to create their own bands. There were several reasons for that. On one hand, they wanted to emulate and to have this new form of performative performance of masculinity in a way, a new way to perform their the individual in the world at the end of the day. And the music in itself proved to be a very lucrative business as well. And seeing what was happening in the Woodstock as well, they started to recreate that feeling and those type of compositions. At the same time, there was a lack of good quality instruments, and many of them actually started to do these do-it-yourself instruments out of small transistors and various electronic and electric components that they could steal from factory, and to reassemble and to create their own electric guitar.
That's what you got to do. You got to steal from the factory.
One person told me that they even took the toilet
lid.
In order to create some electric guitars, right? Or to create a component of that.
Oh, wow. Right?
Or magnetic transistors from the drawers, those who close nicely the drawer as well.
Oh,
they added
the magnets.
Some wires, some magnets on it.
Yeah.
And they created this amplifying system.
Holy moly.
And then this created a sort of fascinating experiment in music, because on one hand they saw the potential of sound and the potential of exploring different sounds and so on, which very quickly, if you see then at that time, if they saw Jim Morrison's experiments and the whole fascination towards psychedelics, then it very nicely went along, so to explore the different forms of sounds and so on. So it involved a lot of experimentation. At the same time, the state tried to at first control the movement, and in many cases there were interdictions, there were constant chase against hippies, the long hair, the hippies and so on. But in other situations, and that's the interesting part that I found, they were trying to tolerate it and to contain it for various reasons, because there was a pulse and indeed there was an effervescence, and they needed to provide this safety valve of expressing themselves and partying, and to contain it in a venue without, and to depoliticize it. But at the same time, it proved to be very lucrative, because there were these institutions called the cultural houses, in which there were very little, they had few audience, and no one was going. But after seeing that the rock concerts were actually bringing a lot of public, they became very, very much interested about this, because again, it provided a sort of income and leisure time. So in a way, the communist states had this, on one hand, various actors like the secret police. Yes, indeed, in many cases there were youngsters that were actually sent into prison, but usually that was doubled by writing letters to Radio Free Europe, so the radio that was based in Munich, and it was broadcasting music and political content. Others, if they were listening to these broadcasts and recorded, they might have been on their list as well, and sometimes visited and had these very unpleasant visits. But there were other vectors of the state, like the cultural houses, especially for students, which again they were very happy to cater always a depoliticized version of it in order to contain the movement and to actually have its own credibility at the end of the day.
Looking at obviously the way the Soviet Union looked at Hungary, at that near abroad, whatever, however they defined it, they thought of it as their sphere of influence. They thought of it as this is basically our backyard, front yard, whatever, however you want to define that. Russia continues to do that these days, right? I mean, Russia continues. I mean, they openly talk about it. They talk about it, just the former Soviet states. They consider them their sphere of influence. And then obviously we have this tragic, horrendous case of Russia invading Ukraine and doing what in my opinion is basically they're trying to genocide Ukrainians. They want to get rid of their entire identity as a people. Looking at what the Soviet Union, how they've approached this, and looking at how Russia today is approaching that, are there any parallels? Are there any lessons to be learned from that? Are there any ways that we can, prevent that from happening again?
I would like to twist a bit the question, and I would like to find similarities in the ways of using vehicles of protest by the Ukrainians against Russia, right? For sure, there are many continuities to briefly answer to your question, and there is a part of a larger sphere of dominance and so on. But what's very striking for me, and it deserves much more attention, is the vehicles of protest that are in many ways built upon the 1968 68ers and the reaction against an oppressor. One way is, and there is one statement that was first referred in 56, then in 68, and then I saw this, we can see that in Ukraine as well, is Russians go back home, and this was written on graffitis. And in 1968, you could see famous pictures in which it were written both in Russian and in Czech. And the statement, it's the same, so verbatim the same one. Then music, which again plays a huge role and an important role, and again, the ways in which creative and all artists bring their own contribution to recreate and to rethink and to process the whole tragedy. The third component, which again it's extremely important, is the universities. And the universities, what happened in Hungary as well, and in Czechoslovakia after the invasion in 68, as the state universities were basically controlled by the secret police and very, very much trimmed, intellectuals, what did they do? They went into their own apartments and held private universities. And that was the so-called flying university or underground universities. Or theater, what did they do? They just had this apartment performances for a trusted public and so on, which that's happening once again in Ukraine. So there are initiatives, educational initiatives that try to provide an alternative. And nowadays, it's not happening in the living room, but in an online format, in which there is the so-called there is this effervescence and this engagement to share different perspectives, to build and to go as close as possible towards the truth, and to provide nuanced approaches. Which, in that regard, that's in my opinion the most meaningful parallel, right? In which, and there's this beautiful continuation. So there is no big, as to go back to the previous question, there is no big, right, 1968, but the vehicles of protest, the sit-in, the university, the archiving the atrocities, the sharing the knowledge throughout underground ways, and networks as well, the informal networks of friendship. That's an aspect that matters, and it's taken from the 1968 period. And it's continued, this legacy is living, even though it's not obvious in very first hands.
We're going to leave it at that, but I think, thank you so much for your time and making such an eloquent argument for why understanding what had happened in something that a couple of generations ago is really important, how those events are shaping what's happening today. And I think one of the things that I find as a message of hope, hopefully, is that, you know, these things happen in Hungary. What happened in Hungary, again, if people don't know, it's truly horrendous. In 1956, what happened in Prague was no less horrendous. Maybe the numbers of those who died was is fewer people, but nonetheless, the impact was so that by decades, the countries were just shifted back decades into the past. And what Russia is doing in Ukraine is horrendous as well. But we're looking at the Czech Republic, at Slovakia, Hungary, and they're successful, sovereign, independent states that are just living up to their potential. And I think the takeaway for me is that this is something that, you know, with the parallels that you've mentioned between those situations and what's happening in Ukraine and the way Ukrainians are reacting and protesting against the Russian invasion, is that, you know, Ukraine is going to have an amazing, bright future as well. Maybe that was not the message that you came in with, but this is what I'm going to take away from this, Adrian. Thank you so much. We will definitely, we don't plug books here, but feel free to do so yourself once this is out. But would really appreciate your time and your commitment to this.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much.